Hello, and welcome to the Inflectra webinar on the new version of SpiraTeam version 5.4. My name is Adam Sandman, and I'll be the presenter today. In today's webinar, we're going to be going through all of the new features and enhancements in the new version of SpiraTeam. The first thing we'll be going through are the new inline graphs that we've added throughout the application. We'll then spend some time looking at the new custom graphing engine, which adds on to the existing custom reporting engine we've had for several years. We'll then focus on the agile planning features of SpiraTeam version 5.4, specifically the new task boards, the new incident Kanban boards, and also enhancements to the existing requirements planning board. After that, we'll talk about two key enhancements we've added to the new version. One is with the new bulk edit permission that lets you more easily manage different users' permissions across the projects, and also some significant performance improvements we've made to improve the speed and usability of the application. So this is SpiraTeam version 5.4, and across the application there have been some changes. So the first thing is the graphing changes, and these are features that you'll see throughout the system. We've had in the system for a long time graphs and charts. So for example, test run graphs, test requirements coverage. This will look familiar to you. But one of the things we realize is we have all these graphs on the dashboards, but we don't necessarily have them in other parts of the application. And if you remember, for those who upgraded to 5.3, we did add some graphs on the incident list page right here, where you can see the number of open defects and closed defects. You can also see the number of open defects by priority. And we tried this out and we got good feedback, so we've actually rolled out the same functionality now across the rest of the application. So just to give you a flavor of what's in the system, if you go to the requirements list page, we now have a new graph on the bottom left. We have a requirements test coverage graph, which is the same as the one on the home page, but instead of being in a bar chart form, is now in a donut chart. And we've had lots of feedback over the years that people want to see different types of chart. We've got a lot of bar charts. We haven't previously had a lot of pie or donut charts, so you will now see a greater variety in the system. So this is a donut chart that gives you the test coverage. And we also have the requirements burn down graph that was also on the dashboard, is now available on the requirements list page. So these are the same graphs you already have, but now they're right here, and they've got tooltips so you can get the data behind them. And that way you haven't got to go back to the project homepage all the time to see your graphs, but they still are available there also. So that's on the requirements page. Now on the testing page, we've done something similar. At the test case level, we now have the test status graph that was a bar chart on the home page, now available as a donut chart as well. And this will change depending on the release you select. So if I change to a different release, the graph will change accordingly. And that's also true on the requirements one I showed previously. So it gives you a nice inline graph right there and then in the system. We did the same thing for test sets. For test sets, we have two graphs. We have one which is the standard test status graph for the entire test set. So it just mirrors what you see here on the list page. You'll see here we have 24 test sets that are not run, and we have test cases that are not run, I should say, and we have 4 test cases in all my sets that passed, and 2 that have failed. And again, you can filter by release, and it will change the value. And we also have another graph that shows you what percentage of your test sets are scheduled in the future, are unscheduled, so they have no date set, or they've been scheduled but the date's in the past already. So that way you can see, are we on track, we have a lot of overdue test sets, and it takes it from the planned date. And that's actually a new graph, so that's one we haven't had before. For test runs, which is the page that shows you all of the executions, we thought the most obvious graph to show you was the test run progress graph. So it's the same as the line graph we have on the home page. It's just shrunk down to a much smaller size, and it only shows a restricted date range. But it gives you the last 15 days, I believe, or 30 days worth of test runs, and so you can see your activity progress. If you want to see a bigger graph than that, you can go back to the main home page, which is right here, and you'll see the same graph right here. So the idea really is just to give you the same experience that you have on the home page, but have those different graphs available throughout the application. The other thing we did is also, if you go into the tracking tasks page, we have added a graph there also. So you can now see the percentage of your tasks that are on schedule, the percentage that are behind schedule, percentage that are running late, which is red, and started late, which is yellow, and then gray are the ones that are in the future. And we also have our test case burn down graph available here as well. So it gives you different views of the tasks, the requirements, the test cases, the test sets with these inline graphs. And we also plan on adding more graphs in the future, both on the dashboards, but also throughout the application. So if you do have some graphs that you think we could do with having that we don't have yet, let us know. We are going to be expanding the graphs in versions to come. So that's some of the new inline graphs we've added. The other thing we've added, which is a major enhancement, is the custom reporting feature. Custom graphing feature. Now, for those who've been with the system for a while will know, we do have the ability to create custom reports, like a printable document. We've had that for several years, and we've got lots of articles on our website that discuss how to do that, how to create one, and we've got lots of examples. So we decided to expand that functionality and add graphing as well. And so the way it works is if you go in as an administrator, you go down to the section, and because we now have graphing and reporting, we've moved the existing edit reports out of the system category into its own category. And just want to make sure, some people are saying no audio. Let me just check here. I think Peter, please connect to the audio. Okay, 1 second. Okay. So people who are not on the audio, they just need to connect through WebEx. Let's make sure. Yeah. Okay, good. So we've moved the graphs into the same section as reporting. So now they have their dedicated section called reporting rather than being under the system section. And so to edit the graphs, you click on the edit graphs option as a system administrator. And basically what that will do is take you into this section where you can see custom graphs. Now, if you have a new installation of SpiraTeam, we do provide 2 test graphs with the system just to play around with. If you've upgraded from a previous version, there won't be any. You'll have to add some. So what I'll show you are some examples of how you can write a custom graph. So first we'll look at one we already have. So when you go to create a graph, you need to give it a name, and that's just the name that will be displayed to the end user who's going to run the graph. There's also a description flag, and that will give the person who's going to run the graph on the reporting dashboard information as to what the graph's meant to do. So let's update that. This graph shows a list of test case statuses and the count of test cases in that status. If you make the graph active, then it's going to be available for immediate use. So do be careful. If you've got a graph that you're not ready to let people use, make sure you set the inactive flag. The position just changes the order it will appear in the list of graphs. So if you've got graphs that are more important, you might want to move them to the top. That's up to you. And then the really important part is the next piece. This is where you actually put in the query. And so you have the full power of SQL to create graphs in the system. And I'll just take this one out for a second. I'll come back to it. If you were to start from scratch like this, you can choose any of the queries we have. For example, let's say I wanted to get test cases information. I can choose test cases like that, and I can display the data grid. That will show you down here all of the data in that table, and it gives you about 10 rows, so that way you can see the kind of data we have. Just 1 second, make sure everyone's connected. Yeah, and once you've got the data in the grid, unlike a report, for a graph, you need to have an x-axis and then you need to have some data ranges. And so the way it works is the first column needs to be the x-axis, and the other columns will have to be numeric and will be the data range. So in this example, what we're going to do is we're going to take the name of the test status, which is this column called test execution status name. And we're going to use that as our first column, like that. And what we then want is the count of the test cases. So we'll just simply add a numeric field called count r.testCaseID, which is the first column. It could be any. We're going to count it, so it can be any of these columns, in fact, as count. And we'll display that data grid. Oh, and I need to add a group by. It's warning me, so that's correct. Group by r.execution status name. That's better. So now we've got the list of test case statuses and the number of test cases in that status. And we haven't filtered out deleted ones and some other things, so you might want to adjust the query. We're also filtering it by project right now. You might decide you want to filter it by project group to get a project group-wide report, or maybe you want a system-wide graph. Then you can just remove the where clause altogether. But the key is you have one column here, which is the graph, the x-axis, and the other column is the data range. And then you can preview what that would look like. So we'll close that, and we'll do preview graph. And you can preview all three graph types. So as a donut chart, it will look like this. As a bar graph, it will look like this. And as a line graph, it will look like that. Now, if you want to have a line graph or a bar graph with multiple ranges, that's very easy to do. You could have a second, third, fourth data column. So all we do is we just add another column. And just for simplicity, I'll take our existing data, multiply it by 2 so it has a different line or a different bar, and I'll call it something different like count2. I'll just do the data grid. There we have our data. And I'll close our graph again, and now I can preview that. Now, when you have more than one range, you can preview a bar graph like that. You can preview a line graph like that, but you can't do a donut chart or a pie chart. That graph only supports a single data range because it's not three-dimensional. So that's an important thing. So that once you've got your graph the way you want it, you just hit the save button, and now it's available. And then for an individual end user, they go to the reporting homepage, and what they'll do is they can just choose the graph to run. So they don't do any of the creation of the graph. That's all done by the system administrator. They basically go in and just run the graph. So that's an important thing. And that's the same thing as with the custom reports we already have. It's up to the administrator to create it and the end user to run it. So just let it load up. There we go. And so this is actually some different graphs we have. So we have some different custom graphs. We already have added this widget to our dashboard. To do that, you go into the add items like this, and you choose the widgets, and you just choose the first one, custom graph. And you can have the same custom graph widget added multiple times, and then what you can do is have the same graph or different graphs appear side by side. So if I have, say here we have 3 different graphs, I might want to have 3 instances of my custom graphs, and then one might show the graph 1, one might show graph 2, one might show this third graph. And you can also change the display setting. If it's got a single data range, you've got all 3 graphs you can choose. If, on the other hand, it's got multiple data ranges, then you'd have to only choose one of these 2 later ones, bar chart or line chart. So those are some examples. And then, as I mentioned, it will include, if there is a description, it will include that in the tooltip here. I guess there isn't one for that graph. So we didn't save the description. And it will look like this as a tooltip. So that way it helps individual users who don't know what the graph is. They can actually then get information about what it's meant to do. So it's important that you add a description if it's a graph that's not obvious from the name. And that's the custom graphing, and it uses the same SQL engine as the main custom reporting that we already have, and we will be publishing various graphs and charts on our website in the same way that we've done that for our custom reports. And so we'll be encouraging people who have questions to post them in our forums, and we will have people sending sample graphs that we found useful. So that's the custom graphing. Now the next thing we've added is some changes around the planning board, and we've also added some tasks boards. So I'll actually go first into the planning board. So the planning board was already in the system before, as you probably remember. We made a few UI changes. We've actually moved the grouping by and the planning drop-downs next to each other. We found that people were constantly moving from left to right to change the 2 options, so we put them together. And we moved all of these selectors here on the top right, again, just to make it a bit easier to use the planning board. We have added some new options. So we've always had the option at the backlog level to be able to, let me just turn off detail view, to view the backlog by component, by package, by priority, by status. That's still the same. But if you remember on the all releases view previously, when you went to all releases to see what is all the stuff that's planned across the entire project, you only had the option to see it by release. We've now added the ability to segment it by priority, by status, and by person. So we've added that option. So you can now move your story cards between people by status to see where they are in the flow of the project, and we've also got the ability to do it by priority. And you can do that across all projects. Previously, you had to select a release or select an iteration to do that. Now you can do it across the whole project. So that's one big change we did. The other thing we did, which you remember, is if you go into a particular sprint or iteration, is you can choose to view the items by priority, by status, or by person. There used to be a view where you could say task by person and task by status, and that let you view just the tasks. But we realized that there's a whole set of functionality specifically around tracking the tasks and tracking the incidents. It really is distinct from requirements, and by having it all on this board, it was making it difficult to use. So we've now created two new additional views. So if you go into tracking, let's start with tasks. We have the same view we had before, where you have a grid where you can look at folders, and as I mentioned, we did add a graph. That hasn't changed, but we have also added a new board view. So you'll see this table and board selector. Now, this is functionality only in SpiraTeam. So if you're using SpiraTest, you won't see this option. You'll only see the table option. And so the board is a new way to view tasks, and it will remember your selection between the two. And what it will let you do is view the tasks in a board form as opposed to having to use the main planning board. So it's just another option. Instead of having to use the incident, the task part rather of the main planning board, we've got a separate board just for tasks. Okay, here it is. And the advantage of that is that you can now look at, for example, the entire project. You can look at a specific release or a specific sprint, but you can now view it by any of the fields that are task specific. So you can now see all of your tasks that are not started, in progress, completed. And the nice thing with that is that previously you can only do that at the iteration level. You can now do it for the project, the release, or for a sprint. And it will use the task statuses, not the requirements ones. You can also do it by priority, which will be the task priorities, not the requirements ones. So you have a fully functional task board now, which is completely separate from the requirements board and lets you manage tasks directly. And you can also, of course, move them between people as well. So you can look at all the tasks and drag and drop them between different people, like this. So that's a nice new feature we added. So you have this dedicated task board, particularly useful on Scrum projects. We also had feedback from our customers that they also often on maintenance projects are dealing a lot with defects, and there was no dedicated incident Kanban board. The main planning board had the ability to show and hide incidents, but you couldn't hide the requirements. You also couldn't see the board organized by incident status, so it limited its usefulness for maintenance projects. So we have listened to that feedback, and we've now added a incident board. In the same way that we did for tasks, there is now a selector between the table view, which is the default, and the board view, which is new in this version. And this is also available for SpiraTeam and SpiraPlan customers, but not for SpiraTest. And the board view lets you look at all of the incidents on the project in different views in a board form. So I can look at the incidents, and I can look at them for the entire project, i.e. all releases, or I can look at a specific release or a specific sprint or iteration. And I can view it by status, which is these are the different statuses of defects. I can look at by release, like that, to see how we align the work. I can look at by person. I guess no one's assigned anything on this. Or by status, like that. So that's one of the new features, is you can now view it across those different segmentations. You can also, of course, as I said, drill it down. So right now I'm looking at a release. If I want to look at just a specific sprint, let's say release 1.1, sprint 1, I can do that and then view it by priority. If there are any, I guess there aren't any in that view, or by status, like that. And you can then drag and drop the items from the release into the sprint. So it makes managing defects very easy, and you can move things very quickly between the different statuses, different people, and so on. So again, just more tools for managing different kinds of projects. So that means we now have a incident board, incident list, task board, task list, the main requirements page, and then the main planning board, and they're all available in the system. So those are some of the new features around the boards. Now the other thing we've added is also a change which is necessary because some of these improvements. So one of the challenges we've had in the past is that you might want to let someone, for example, modify defects or tasks or requirements, and you want them to have to be able, you want them to be able to modify any requirement in the system, but you didn't want them to be able to do broad editing like this, dragging and dropping, moving things around. They're not meant to have that level of permission. You want them to follow the workflows that you set up in the project. You don't want them to be able to bypass the workflows on these boards or list pages where it's much more freeform, but you still want them to be able to modify any requirement or any defect, not just the ones they're assigned. And so that was one of the challenges we had before. And so one of the things we did in this new version is we've implemented this new permission called bulk edit. And that's pretty important because if you've created any custom roles, you may need to go back in after the upgrade and check out the roles that you have and make sure they still meet your needs, because it may be that the new permission model we've added means you may want to go in and slightly change some of the role definitions. So let's wait for the page to load, and whilst that's loading, what I'll quickly mention is that that means for every artifact type now, whereas before you had modify owned and modify all, you now have a third option called bulk edit. So for any given artifact, you have 3 different types of modify permission. So let's go and have a look at that. So we go to view edit roles, and we go into, let's say, a developer role. Previously, bulk edit was listed, but it wasn't being used. There was a yellow warning down here which said, this is a future functionality, be aware of it. And we put that in there so people could start to set the roles up knowing it was coming. But since you may not have realized, I want to highlight this because it is important. So let's look at, for example, incidents. If I've got the permission to modify owned, that means I as a user can actually modify any defect that either was created by me or modified by me. I can't go to the list page of incidents or the board. I have to click on an item and go to its detailed page, follow the workflow for the item, use the workflow operations, and make changes. But I have to actually be the owner or the creator. If I'm not one of those two things, I can't make any changes. Now, there's also modify all. Modify all now in the new version will let you modify any incident. In this case, you don't have to be the owner or the person who created it, but you still can't use the list page, you still can't use any of the boards. You have to click on the item's hyperlink, you have to go to the page for that one item, you have to follow the workflow rules, enter the required fields, use the permissions, use the drop down to change the status, enter electronic signatures, all the things that require you to actually follow the workflow. If you want to be able to do mass editing of incidents, I want to be able to drag and drop them on the planning boards or the task boards or the incident boards, I want to be able to use the edit buttons on the list pages, you will now have to have bulk edit. It's a separate permission, and it's above and beyond modify all. So that's a really important feature change. So definitely in preparation for 5.4, we would recommend going through all the projects, all the roles you've set people up on, and the permissions, and just make sure that come Monday, for when you download and upgrade to 5.4, or next Saturday when you are upgraded automatically as part of our cloud rollout, make sure that all the roles you have in the system are correctly set, so that way users won't get frustrated. But that's really the only major change in terms of a breaking change for the system. Almost everything else in this version is additive. So we've got new graphs, new custom graphing, new pages to do the boards for lists. For the most part, there aren't major UI changes in terms of how the system works. In previous versions, we changed some of the layout, so that shouldn't be too much work from a rollout and training perspective. There is one other feature I just remembered we did add. We also added in the requirements page the option to split a requirement. So if you want to be able to split a requirement, that's an option you have as well. So one of the things you can do is you can actually split a requirement into 2 different ones if you wanted to move it to a new sprint. We already had it for tasks, but now we have it for requirements. So those are some of the major functionality improvements. Another thing we've done is made some performance improvements, and we've actually been doing some work to improve the page load times and the navigation times, and we've cut down the page load times on our production environments during testing from about 1.5 seconds a page load to about less than half a second. So it's about a 70 to 80% improvement. You'll notice that on the new version when you start using it. We also will be making some improvements around some of the editing on the grids, which we feel are still not as fast as we would like. That's going to come in an update 5.4.01 in about a month's time. So we're going to do some additional performance tuning after the rollout of 5.4's core release as an update. There also may be some small improvements we'll make to the source code module also in that 5.4.01 update, plus any bug fixes we find in the new version. And that's the main plan for version 5.4. The rollout on Monday for download, Saturday the 10th for cloud, and then a month later there'll be a patch update with any bugs we find or any small things we want to tune in the new version. So that's an overview of what's coming in the new version. I'd like to open up for Q&A. So if you would like to ask a question, feel free to unmute your line, or if you want to ask it through the chat window, feel free to write in the chat window and I'll read it out for everyone on the call. Okay, so the first question is, when is it going to be released? Just to clarify, it's going to be released on Monday, the February, coming up, I think it's the 5th. Let me just double check my calendar. I believe it's the 5th. It's the next Monday coming up, which I think is the 5th. Hold on. Yes, Monday the 5th. So it's about 4 days time it's coming out. That's for download customers. For cloud customers, it will be Saturday, February the 10th, during our regular maintenance window. How to split a requirement. Okay, great. Let's do that. So split a requirement, what you do, I'll close the window, is, if I remember correctly, it's in here. You go to the requirement page, and it's very similar to what we had for tasks, so it's familiar for the people who use that already. Go to the requirement page, go to the detail page, and then go Tools, Split. And what you do is you give it the name of the new requirement. So let's say this was the ability to add new books to the system. Maybe we're going to split the requirement in half and say maybe we want to add new books to the system in bulk, because we only implemented part of the functionality. We realize there's more coming. And then you can decide, do we want to have it assigned to the current user? So it's currently assigned to Joe Smith. Do we want to have it assigned to Joe Smith? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, we can leave it. Otherwise, we could choose someone else. The estimate would be, we have a 2.0 story estimate. Let's say we want to make the next one, we want to move half of it, so we can move 1.0 points over. And then the comment would be a comment you want to add to the association that's created between them, because it will create an association automatically. You're splitting off the bulk edit feature like that. Hit split, and it will do the splitting. And once it's done, you will have a new requirement, and it will actually redirect you to the new one. It will be one below the old one, so if I expand out, you'll see the two of them now. There you go, there's the old one, there's the new one, and you'll see there's 1.0 estimate, and if you go to the Associations tab, you'll see there's a comment. And if you go to the old one, you can see the same thing. It's gone from 2.0 to 1.0, and in the history, you'll see the change. And you'll see the association going the other direction. So that's the splitting feature. Any other questions? Oh, for the custom reports, will you be able to use the two variables to filter by project and project group? Currently, yes. The only two variables that you can pass in as a person running the report in the current version will be project and project group. So we don't yet support things like release or other values. That, along with the same need in the custom reporting, is something we plan on adding in the future. But in the current version of both reporting and graphing, those are the only two variables. That's a good question. Thanks for watching today's webinar. I hope it was helpful. If you'd like to learn more about our products or software testing or Agile Lifecycle Management, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Have a great day.